what is the average of the first 90 measurements in a certain list of 92 measurements? So average should be the sum of my 92 measurements over the number of measurements, so just 92. Or if I want to, I can write that as average is equal to, so I could break my sum up into the sum of the first 90 measurements plus the sum of my final 2 measurements all over 92. And we want to know what is the average of our first 90 measurements. Okay, so we can think about that's the sum of our 90 measurements over 90, but without knowing more information, I don't know if I necessarily want to rephrase this as, so I'll just leave this as is and know that this is what we're looking for, the average of our first 90 terms. The average of all 92 measurements is 7 centimeters. So we know here 7 is equal to the sum of our first 90 measurements plus the sum of our final 2 measurements all over 92. So we get, we can find our total sum for our 92 measurements. But that's not going to help us because we don't know how much of that came from our first 90 measurements and how much of that came from our final 2. So even so, what's 92 times 7? 644. So we know 644 is equal to the sum of our first 90 plus the sum of our final 2, but that's still only takes us so far. So this is insufficient. Statement 2 says the average of the last 2 measurements is 7.2 centimeters. So that means 7.2 is equal to the sum of our last 2 measurements over 2. And so the sum of our last 2 measurements, that means is equal to 14.4. Okay, but by itself, we would still need to know the sum of our first 90 measurements in order to answer our question. So this is still insufficient. So together, what do we know? We know this sum here is 14.4. And together, our numerator here has to equal 644. So from that, so we can get the sum of our first 90 measurements. So if I say 14.4 plus x is equal to 644, where x is the sum of our first 90 measurements. What is that? So 644 minus 14 is 630. So 629.6. So that is the sum of my first 90 measurements. So if I want the average, that's just going to be the sum of my first 90 measurements, 629.6 over 90. And I don't know what that is, but I don't need to know what that is to know it's something. So together they are sufficient, and C is the answer.